She is probably the most famous woman from the ancient world. A pharaoh that captured the hearts of some of the mightiest men in her time, and a ruler that started a golden age for her empire. Cleopatra, a name that has echoed through history as a symbol of power, beauty, and intelligence. But who was Cleopatra, really? Beyond her image as a glamorous seductress in Renaissance paintings and Hollywood movies, she was a ruler of Greek descent, the last active ruler of the Ptolemaic dynasty, a lineage of Macedonian Greeks that ruled over Egypt for nearly 300 years. Cleopatra was a blend of many cultures. She spoke multiple languages and was the first in her family to truly adopt Egyptian customs and religion, aiming to fulfill her role as a traditional Egyptian pharaoh. But how exactly did her reputation survive the centuries? Was she really that special? Let's explore how a pharaoh, a mother, and a ruler created a legacy that has lived for more than 2,000 years. Cleopatra was born in Alexandria in 69 BCE, daughter of King Ptolemy XII, and a mother whose identity we are not sure of. She was born into a troubled royal dynasty. Although the Ptolemies had ruled Egypt for nearly 3 centuries, their dynasty was now under a great deal of pressure from the Romans and struggled to hold on to power. Growing up within the royal court, Cleopatra was exposed to both luxury and political intrigue. She observed firsthand the complexities of court life, learning valuable lessons in diplomacy and governance. Amidst familial rivalries and shifting alliances, Cleopatra gained insight into the challenges that come with maintaining power. She received a well-rounded education in subjects such as philosophy, astronomy, and rhetoric. Under the guidance of her tutors, including the esteemed philosopher Philostratus, she developed critical thinking skills and a deep appreciation for knowledge. Fluent in languages like Greek, Latin, and Egyptian, Cleopatra was the first known Ptolemy that actually spoke Egyptian. Her upbringing and education would lay the groundwork for her future leadership, drawing from her education and diverse skill set in order to navigate the complex political landscape of Egypt. These early experiences would shape her reign and contribute to her enduring legacy as one of history's most renowned figures. In 51 BCE, Cleopatra's father passed away. His will declared that Cleopatra, then 18 years old, should share the throne with her 10-year-old brother and husband, Ptolemy. It was customary at the time for siblings to marry. During Cleopatra's co-rulership with her brother, Egypt faced various challenges. The kingdom struggled economically, grappled with issues such as declining revenues, debt, and inflation. Additionally, natural disasters like floods and famine worsened the situation. Political instability was prevalent, as factions within the royal court competed for power and influence. Amidst these difficulties, Cleopatra tried to establish her authority and navigate the complex dynamics of Egyptian politics. Unfortunately, her attempts came to a halt when tensions with her brother and his advisors arose, which quickly escalated. Cleopatra was forced into exile as a result of her brother conspiring against her with his advisors. They sought to strengthen their own power within Egypt and saw Cleopatra as a threat to their authority. As a result, they marginalized her influence within the royal court, and eventually, Cleopatra was stripped from power. The situation escalated to the point where Cleopatra's safety was at risk, leaving her no choice but to flee Egypt. According to historical accounts, Cleopatra escaped from Alexandria in secret, likely with the help of loyal supporters. she may have disguised herself as a commoner to avoid detection by her enemies. Finally, in 49 BCE, Cleopatra successfully escaped Egypt. This led her to seek refuge in Syria, where she hoped to find the necessary aid to help her regain her position as pharaoh. Cleopatra's exile coincided with the rise of Julius Caesar in Rome. The prominent Roman general and statesman experienced an increase in power and influence after having gained the upper hand in a civil war between the military leaders Caesar and Pompey. After having suffered a series of defeats, Pompey fled to Egypt hoping to win the support of Cleopatra's brother Ptolemy. This set the stage for a series of events that would lead to her eventual alliance with Julius Caesar, a key turning point in her quest to reclaim power in Egypt. In 48 BCE, Julius Caesar arrived in Alexandria in pursuit of his rival Pompey. Caesar expected to have to force Pompey to surrender, but instead he was presented with Pompey's severed head. Cleopatra's brother Ptolemy had him assassinated, hoping to gain favor with the powerful Roman general. However, Caesar was displeased with this gesture, as he had hoped to reconcile with Pompey rather than witness his brutal demise. Whether or not Caesar was genuinely upset about his rival having been murdered, he must have felt like he could not allow the assassination of a Roman general by a foreign power to go unpunished. Caesar responded by bringing his 4,000 soldiers off their ships and into the city. The Romans paraded through the streets as if they were a conquering army. It didn't take long for the people of Alexandria to protest the Roman occupation. Riots broke out in which several Roman soldiers ended up being killed, making the streets unsafe for Caesar and his army. In need for a safe place, Caesar took his army and stormed the royal court. Caesar initially entered the city with the intention to force Pompey's surrender. Instead, in a matter of days, he had engulfed the city in a riot. On top of that, with his occupation of the royal court, Caesar had captured the 13-year-old king, Cleopatra's brother, King Ptolemy XIII. Meanwhile, Cleopatra had returned to Alexandria from her exile in Syria. Accompanied by an army of mercenaries, she was stationed outside the city. Determined to reclaim the throne, Cleopatra devised a bold plan in order to attempt to gain Caesar's support. She would have herself rolled up in a carpet in order to be smuggled into the city, into the royal court, and somehow, all the way into Caesar's private quarters. Oddly enough, her plan would succeed. Once in Caesar's presence, Cleopatra emerged from the carpet, and with her charm and beauty, she managed to persuade him to support her cause and make Caesar recognize her value as a potential ally. Having found a common cause together, they demanded the peaceful return of Cleopatra as co-ruler with the young Ptolemy, like their father's will had declared. Caesar made it clear that his decree were to be upheld under his supervision. This Roman intervention caused the tensions in the city to reach a boiling point. Under pressure of his advisors, Ptolemy declared war on the Roman intruders. The riots in the city that were already protesting the Roman occupation now abruptly shifted into a full-fledged siege of the royal court with the full support of the Egyptian army. This marked the start of a conflict now known as the Siege of Alexandria. Caesar decided to make the first move. He would lead his men straight out the gates of the royal court, charging in a turtle formation as they made their way to the royal harbor. Their arrival at the docks would be met with some serious resistance. As an intense fight erupted down by the docks, the Romans would add to the chaos by setting fire to a number of ships, successfully crippling the Egyptian fleet. Caesar and his men would slowly secure their position, after which they had the street closed off and the royal court fortified. Meanwhile, the fire in the harbor spread through parts of the city, also damaging the famous Library of Alexandria. Luckily, it suffered minimal damage. The siege would continue to go on for months, slowly placing Caesar in a desperate position, until finally, reinforcements arrived to his aid. Upon the arrival of the Roman allies, the conflict culminated into the Battle of the Nile, which would be a decisive confrontation between Caesar's forces and those loyal to Ptolemy. In the ensuing battle, the Roman and Egyptian forces clashed on land and water. The Roman legions set out to destroy Ptolemy's army, which used the natural defenses of a steep hilltop in order to protect themselves. Caesar would decide to split up his army, attacking the hill from the flanks. The Egyptian infantry struggled as they were outflanked, showered with arrows and javelins. The Romans managed to destroy the Egyptian army and slaughter its soldiers. This victory cemented Caesar's position in Egypt and secured Cleopatra's reign as pharaoh. Ptolemy, at the young age of 13, drowned in the Nile River. Cleopatra now faced one less challenge. Before he would return to Rome, Caesar stayed with Cleopatra in Egypt for some time. In this period, the two developed a relationship which blossomed into a passionate romance, one that would lead to the birth of her firstborn. In 47 BCE, Cleopatra, at 21 years of age, gave birth to then 52-year-old Caesar's son, Ptolemy Caesar, later known as Caesarion. With the birth of her son, Cleopatra now had a direct heir to Caesar by her side. This strengthened her position. She would go on to develop a powerful new identity as a semi-divine mother and claim to be associated with the goddess Isis. Now more than ever, she was determined to guide Egypt through a period of transition. Under Cleopatra's rule, Egypt experienced a period of relative stability and prosperity. She implemented reforms aimed at revitalizing the economy, promoting trade, and improving infrastructure throughout the kingdom. Cleopatra's administration was characterized by a commitment to social welfare, as she sought to ensure the well-being of her subjects and help create a climate of cultural and intellectual growth. She funded the construction of schools and academies, initiated the expansion and maintenance of Egypt's intricate irrigation systems, and she realized the construction and expansion of public buildings, including temples, marketplaces, and bathhouses. Cleopatra's philanthropic efforts were not limited to times of peace and prosperity. She demonstrated remarkable compassion and resourcefulness during times of crisis, particularly during famines and natural disasters. Historical records describe instances where Cleopatra ordered the distribution of food to her starving subjects during times of crop failure. She also provided shelter and relief to those affected by floods along the Nile, demonstrating her commitment to the welfare of her people, even in the face of adversity. Despite Egypt's relative peace under Cleopatra's rule, she remained vigilant in protecting her kingdom from external threats. Cleopatra maintained a formidable navy and army to defend Egypt's borders and deter potential invaders. She also formed strategic alliances with neighboring states to bolster Egypt's military strength and security. All in all, the Egyptian pharaoh seemed to have successfully transitioned her empire into times of prosperity. In 45 BCE, Cleopatra decided to follow Caesar. She organized an expedition to Rome. This was a significant event, not just in her life, but in the broader context of the ancient world. Her journey to Rome was a calculated move, aimed at securing her position as the ruler of Egypt and ensuring the survival of her kingdom in the face of the expanding Roman power. Cleopatra did not travel alone. She was accompanied by a large entourage, including her servants, advisors, and her young son, Caesarion. Cleopatra's arrival in Rome was a spectacle that captured the imagination of the Roman populace. The city had seen many foreign royal visits, but none quite like the Pharaoh of Egypt. During her stay in the city, Cleopatra was not a passive observer. She was an active participant in the social and political life of the city. She attended social gatherings, engaged with Roman nobility, and used her charm and intelligence to win allies and influence people. Her presence in Rome was a cultural event in itself, introducing the Romans to the customs, fashions, and traditions of Egypt. At this time, Julius Caesar was at the height of his power, and his popularity with the Roman populace was unmatched. However, his relationship with the foreign queen was frowned upon by the Roman elite, and his apparent desire to become a monarch was seen as a threat to the Roman Republic and its traditions. Roman senators feared losing their remaining power, so they conspired against Caesar's life. In 44 BCE, Gaius Julius Caesar was murdered by a group of senators during a Senate gathering. According to historical accounts, he was stabbed up to 23 times. The city was thrown into chaos, and Rome was no longer a safe place for Cleopatra. In this volatile environment, she made the decision to return to Egypt. Understandably, her departure from Rome was not as grand as her arrival. She had navigated the complexities of Roman politics, secured alliances, and left a lasting cultural impact. Now she had to return to her own kingdom and face the challenges that awaited her there. Caesar's death sent shockwaves throughout the Roman world. It had profound implications for Cleopatra and her kingdom. After her arrival back in Egypt, she was met with uncertainty in court politics and external pressure from neighboring powers, seeking to exploit her kingdom's vulnerability in the wake of Caesar's demise. To top it off, unreliable Nile flooding would lead to crop failures, inflation, and hunger. However, over time, she would secure her dominance over Egypt through politics, diplomacy, and alliances. Meanwhile, in the aftermath of Caesar's assassination, Rome was left with a power vacuum. Initially, Mark Antony, a trusted general and politician who had assisted Julius Caesar in his rise to power, took on the role of leader of Rome. His authority was soon challenged by other prominent figures, including Octavius, Caesar's adopted son and heir. Rivalry between the two would intensify as they competed for control over Caesar's legacy and the future direction of the Roman Republic. However, despite their differences, Mark Antony and Octavian worked together to defeat the forces of Brutus and Cassius, the key figures in the conspiracy that led to the assassination of Julius Caesar. After their victory in 42 BCE, they agreed on a distribution of power in Rome. Antony took control of the eastern provinces, including the rich territories of Asia Minor, modern-day Turkey, while Octavian governed the western provinces, comprising much of present-day Europe. Shortly thereafter, Mark Antony summoned Cleopatra to the Sicilian city of Tarsus, south of modern-day Turkey. He wanted her to explain what role she had played in the complicated aftermath of Caesar's assassination. Cleopatra seized this opportunity to showcase her intelligence, charm, and resources, aiming to impress Antony and perhaps form a valuable alliance. And so, she set out for Tarsus in Asia Minor, loaded with gifts while delaying her departure, in order to heighten Antony's expectation. When Cleopatra finally arrived, she made a grand entrance sailing a dazzling boat up the river. It was a large barge with a stern made of gold, silver-tipped oars that dipped in and out of the water, and large purple sails that billowed in the wind. The Egyptian pharaoh was dressed in robes of the new Isis, symbolizing her divine status as the pharaoh of Egypt. Struck by her intelligence and appearance, Mark Antony was in awe of the Egyptian pharaoh. Their meeting would prove to be the start of a diplomatic and romantic affair. When Cleopatra set sail back to Egypt, she would invite Mark Antony to visit her in her kingdom. Antony would eventually take her up on her offer, leaving behind his third wife, Fulvia, and their children in Rome. He spent the winter of 41 to 40 BCE in Alexandria, during which Cleopatra's courtship with Antony was a spectacle of luxury and extravagance, a testament to the wealth and grandeur of Egypt under her rule. Lavish feasts were held in Antony's honor, with tables adorned with the finest delicacies from across the kingdom. Exotic wines flowed freely, and the air was filled with the aroma of rare spices and incense. Together, Cleopatra and Antony indulged in their shared love of luxury and spectacle, forging a powerful alliance that transcended mere politics. In 40 BCE, Mark Antony departed Egypt and returned to Rome. After his departure, Cleopatra would give birth to twins, Helios, a name of Greek origin which means the sun, and Selene, which means the moon. When he got back to Rome, Mark Antony resumed his relationship with his wife Fulvia, but his heart belonged to Cleopatra. Tragically, eventually Fulvia fell ill and passed away. Mark Antony was forced to prove his loyalty to Octavian by entering a diplomatic marriage with Octavian's half-sister, Octavia. Together they had 3 kids in a time span of 2 years. Against Octavian's will, the romance between Mark Antony and Cleopatra was not over. In 37 BCE, after having been apart for 3 years, they reunited in the city of Antioch, where they made their union official as they decided to get married. Cleopatra provided Mark Antony with funds for his long-delayed military campaign against the kingdom of Parthia. In exchange, he agreed to return much of Egypt's Eastern Empire. During this time, they became lovers again, which led to Cleopatra giving birth to another son, Ptolemy Philadelphus, in 36 BCE. In the same year, Mark Antony finally invaded Parthia. The campaign was plagued by various challenges, including harsh weather conditions, disease among his troops, and betrayal from some of his allies. As a result, he was forced to make a costly retreat, suffering the loss of some 30,000 men. 2 years later, in 34 BCE, he would have a successful skirmish in Armenia, in which he captured the king and the Armenian royal family. They were taken back to Alexandria as prisoners. Upon his return in Alexandria, Antony held a military parade and rode into the city on a chariot, presenting the royal prisoners to Pharaoh Cleopatra. A grand celebration followed, now known as the Donations of Alexandria. During the festivities, Mark Antony would give a speech in which he declared Caesarion as Julius Caesar's son and rightful heir. He would also distribute lands that belonged to Rome and Parthia among Cleopatra's children. When Mark Antony later sent a report to Rome, requesting approval of these territorial claims, the Roman Senate rejected the proposal. Back in Rome, Caesar's true and rightful heir, Octavian, felt his political position threatened by Mark Antony's declaration. In late 34 BCE, Octavian launched a propaganda campaign against Mark Antony. He accused Antony of unlawfully detaining the king of Armenia, marrying Cleopatra despite still being married to his sister Octavia, and wrongfully claiming Caesarion as the heir of Caesar instead of Octavian. These accusations were a part of Octavian's effort to discredit Antony and rally support against him. Ultimately, in 32 BCE, the Roman Senate stripped Antony of all his titles, and Octavian declared war on Cleopatra. With Antony stripped of his titles and war declared on Cleopatra, they decided to move their armies and make a stand in Greece. Mark Antony, being popular in the region, spent the better part of a year recruiting men locally. One issue that complicated things were supplies. They were supplying their armies all the way from Egypt, with a constant flow of ships crossing the Mediterranean. Eventually, in the south of Greece, Octavian's forces would seize the city that served as a supply base for Antony and Cleopatra's forces. By the time Cleopatra and Antony realized what was happening, Octavian had launched a surprise attack coming from the north. In late 31 BCE, cornered and unable to have themselves resupplied, Cleopatra and Mark Antony inevitably ran out of food, leaving them with no other option but to act. This marked the start of a conflict now known as the Battle of Actium. Antony's plan was to use his fleet to charge at Octavian's center, hoping to slay Octavian and win the battle, while Cleopatra and some other admirals stood in reserve, watching the battle from a distance. Antony's fleet successfully managed to board Octavian's flagship. However, they discovered that the man wearing Octavian's armor was a decoy. Antony had been outsmarted, and by now, his ships had been surrounded. As multiple galleys had caught fire, he was forced to quite literally jump ship. Seeing Antony's ship on fire, Cleopatra was led to believe that Antony had died. She took her Egyptian fleet and fled the battle. In reality, Mark Antony had swum to a small vessel, gathered a number of ships, and managed to follow her. Cleopatra and Antony were dealt a decisive defeat and were forced to flee across the Mediterranean, back to Egypt. The defeat at Actium had sealed their fate and would set in motion their downfall. Although Octavian may have won the battle in Greece, Mark Antony was still alive, which meant that the fight was not over. And so, he decided to invade Egypt. In the spring of 30 BCE, Octavian landed his legions in Egypt and set course on Alexandria. His army would overcome every resistance Cleopatra and Mark Antony offered. They advanced quickly, eventually making camp in the outskirts of the city. Perhaps in an attempt to die an honorable death in combat, Antony collected his last forces and marched out of the city. As his forces lined up for combat, Antony's cavalry surrendered to Octavian, later followed by his naval fleet. Still determined, Antony and his infantry fought against Octavian's legions, but they were quickly defeated and forced to retreat back into the city. Mark Antony had lost yet another battle against Octavian. He would now come to the realization that his odds at winning against his rival were non-existent. In the meantime, Cleopatra was in search for shelter and had decided to hide herself in her mausoleum. Mark Antony, amidst the chaos, was falsely informed that Cleopatra had committed suicide. Antony responded by stabbing himself in the stomach in an attempt to take his own life. In his weakened state, he was brought to Cleopatra's mausoleum, where, at 53 years of age, he died in her arms. Following Antony's death, Cleopatra attempted to commit suicide by setting fire to her mausoleum. However, Roman soldiers found entry to the tomb. She was taken captive and escorted to the palace. Determined to choose her own faith rather than submit to Roman rule, she arranged for poisonous snakes to be smuggled into her chambers and allowed one to bite her, ending her life. In late 39 BCE, at age 39, Cleopatra, the last pharaoh of Egypt, would draw her last breath and die.